All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're talking about a philosopher who tackled some of the biggest questions in a way that was so direct, so powerful, that his colleagues said it was like being hit by a ton of bricks. And that man was G.E. Moore.
So, let's start with a really simple question. Just look down at your hands for a second. Go on. Do they actually exist? I mean, of course they do, right? Seems like the most obvious thing in the world. But what if I told you that for hundreds of years, proving that very fact was one of philosophy's biggest headaches?
Yeah, you see, there was this really powerful tradition in philosophy that basically said we're all kind of locked inside our own heads. We know our thoughts, we know our feelings, but how can we be 100% certain that there's a real physical world out there causing all those sensations? This big idea has a name. It's called idealism. And at its most extreme, it suggests that things, tables, chairs, even your own hands, they only really exist because a mind is thinking about them. For a long time, this was a major viewpoint, and this is the philosophical giant that G.E. Moore decided he was going to try and knock over. So who was this guy, Moore? Well, his friend Gilbert Ryle gave this absolutely unforgettable description. He said Moore was like a medieval scholar, a ton of bricks, and your farmer uncle, all at once. I mean, what a combo. It perfectly captures his style. Incredibly smart, brutally direct, and totally down to earth. And make no mistake, Moore was a philosophical heavyweight. His whole career was like a series of major attacks on the status quo. All the way back in 1903, he drops the refutation of idealism, and this whole fight came to a head in his now legendary 1939 lecture, Proof of an External World. And that lecture brings us to Moore's most famous, most controversial, and maybe most brilliant argument. This is how he tried to shatter centuries of deep philosophical doubt with a simple wave of his hand. You have to picture this, a room full of academics, people who have written book after book debating reality. Moore gets up. He holds up one hand and says, "Here is one hand." Then he holds up his other hand and says, "Here is another." His conclusion? Therefore, at least two external objects exist. Boom, proof done. To his colleagues, this was either the most childish thing they'd ever seen, or it was absolutely genius. Now, that whole hand thing wasn't just a gimmick. For Moore, it was the tip of the iceberg. It stood for all these other things he called obvious truisms. Stuff like what you see here. We know we have a body. We know the Earth was here before us. Moore's whole point was that we are more certain of these common sense facts than we are of any complicated philosophical argument. So if some theory tells you your hands aren't real, well, for Moore, that just means the theory is wrong. Simple as that. So there you have it. Moore, the great champion of common sense, the guy who cuts through all the philosophical noise. But this is where the story gets really interesting, because this supposedly straightforward man is actually one of modern philosophy's great paradoxes. I mean, his peers were just in awe of his brain. C.D. Broad said that probably no one in history was better than Moore at analyzing problems and tearing apart bad arguments. He was like the ultimate philosophical demolition expert. He could find the one tiny flaw in your reasoning and bring your entire system crashing down. And this slide just lays out the paradox perfectly. On one hand, people praised his unrivaled power of analysis. But on the other hand, critics would say he was a weak and unsatisfying answerer. He was a genius at showing you why everyone else was wrong, but when it came time for him to build his own theory, well, that's where he struggled. And here is the biggest twist of them all. The guy who built his entire reputation on defending the simple, common-sense view of the world, well, he actually had a theory of his own that was deeply, deeply weird and not very commonsensical at all. It's called the theory of sense data. So what on earth is a sense datum? Well, Moore argued that we don't actually see physical objects directly. Instead, we see these private mental things. So take a round coin. If you look at it from an angle, it looks like an oval, right? Moore would say that you're not seeing the round coin itself. No, you're directly seeing an oval-shaped thing in your mind, a sense datum. Just think about that for a second. The great defender of common sense is telling us we don't directly see the world at all. Even he couldn't quite make it all fit together. So, if he was so good at demolition but not construction, what's his legacy? Why are we still talking about G.E. Moore today? Well, because it turns out his real contribution wasn't about giving us the answers. It was about laying the foundation for other people's genius. His friend Gilbert Ryle had this just perfect metaphor. He said that the brilliant Ludwig Wittgenstein had the sails. He had the incredible soaring ideas. But sails are useless without the keel and the ballast to keep the ship steady. And that's what Moore provided. He was the anchor. He was the grounding force that kept philosophy from just floating away into nonsense. And that's the key takeaway, really. Moore didn't leave behind a system of beliefs. He left behind a method. He taught a whole generation of thinkers how to be brutally honest and clear, how to analyze arguments with incredible precision, and he forced them to go back and ask the most basic questions they thought they already knew the answers to. And if you want the ultimate proof of how important he was, get this. Ludwig Wittgenstein, who many consider the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, spent the last year and a half of his life completely obsessed with Moore's work. He was still trying to wrestle with that simple proof about hands. Now that is influence. Which kind of leaves us with this final question. Moore was a master at asking questions, but often struggled to find his own answers. He could tear down these huge, elaborate theories, but had trouble building his own. So what does his story tell us about how we make progress? What really matters more? Finding the answers or getting better and better at asking the right questions?